Hello and welcome to Star USA Training. Today is Tuesday, March 9th, and we'll be talking about compliance best practices in the remote work environment. We are recording this webinar. The slides in the recording and all other materials will be made available after the broadcast. Participants are currently muted, and the Q&A feature is available. If you have any questions, I strongly encourage them, and I'll get to those at the end of the webinar. Today's session is eligible for 1 CCS CES credit. Emails should be sent to train@starusa.org after the webinar with your ID number. Before we jump in, just a little bit of background on Star USA and myself. Star is a trade and compliance consulting, advice, training, and services company. We specialize in and outsourced trade operations, policies and procedures, audit and disclosure, HTS, origin, value verifications, AD/CVD, broker and forwarder management and oversight, and of course, training in all areas of trade and compliance. This is our 25th year in business. We're very excited about this milestone. It's been a quarter century of a lot of interesting times over the years. I've been with the company for going on 17 years now. My name is Mike Easton. I am the president and general manager, licensed customs broker. One other little bit of news is our new website is launched as of last week. So if you haven't got a chance to check that out, please go ahead and go there. We do have our past trainings linked on our resources page, so you'll be able to watch those. So today's session is about recognizing and acknowledging some of the brand new challenges that have manifested in our industry over the last year. It's a bit of a departure from our usual webinar format, and I wanted to take a moment to point out that our field is filled with remarkable individuals who face new and challenging obstacles every day. And that really can't be understated or overstated. We have some very unique individuals in the trade compliance field, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to join this webinar today to take a look at some of these challenges. Generally speaking, solving problems is what we do as a profession. Just yesterday, in fact, I was talking to a colleague on how much of our days are focused on whatever the problem of the moment happens to be. We don't get the luxury of working on a solved process. Once it's solved, we hand it off typically to someone else in the organization, and then we move on to the next problem. So it's problem to problem to problem to problem. And that's never been more true than it is in these current state of affairs. To everyone else that's on the webinar that's in that same boat, I want to spend a moment just recognizing your efforts, congratulating you as individuals. Your efforts are often unseen and unpraised, and I do want you to know that you are seen and you deserve recognition for keeping your head above water over the last several years. Everyone watching this webinar right now gets it, and you're not alone. I think it's important to state that up front. So when thinking about remote work, it's important to remember this isn't a new concept. There are solutions that have been developing consistently over the last 10 plus years. They've never really been quite in the same level of focus as they have been over the last year, but studies have already been conducted and they've found tremendous benefits to workers in remote circumstances. There's an increase in employee engagement and a boost to individuals' quality of life, which is extremely important, particularly as we're dealing with struggles that are happening in our environments, in our personal lives, and our professional industry. So it's important not to overlook the benefits of these circumstances. Even as we recognize the new challenges and the position that we find ourselves in, it's important to recognize and adapt to those new challenges. So for this webinar, I wanted to zero in on the primary areas that will make the most impact in today's work environment. And with that being said, one of the primary challenges that we're faced with is communication. Communication was already a top tier challenge for trade compliance professionals even before the world changed. We're an industry of knowledge professionals needing to support, sometimes persuade, direct, and navigate all kinds of scenarios. Many of us leverage technology to facilitate that communication, but it's easy to find ourselves drowning in it. I want to spend a minute talking about how technology plays a role and how we can make it work better for our own circumstances. And I'm going to use a lot of experiences from my own life and from my own work. Over the last year, Star invested extensively into things like personal time management and accountability efforts in order to provide our teams with a healthy mindset and perspective on personal and professional time management. And never before have those things needed to be so in sync as they are today and in that remote work, in that distributed work environment. In fact, we hired my wife's company, Focus to Evolve, to help frame out some of the practices for creating that same balance between personal and professional life. And I would recommend anyone with the opportunity to investigate or evaluate those sorts of opportunities to try and strike that balance in your personal and professional life, particularly when a lot of us are working from home and having to balance the fact that the kids are in the house, or that we've got a phone call right in the middle of what would otherwise be our lunchtime, because nobody's got a sense of what time means anymore. So if anyone's looking for those critical methods to achieve that balance, there's a link at the end of the webinar. The technologies that we use to navigate our daily lives have critical advantages and disadvantages. Email is arguably the most impacted technology in this new environment. With so many people working remote and distributed, simple conversations that would normally happen over cubicle walls or in a small reading room have now shifted to typed exchanges over email, and they're starting to pile up. Companies that don't have a better form of casual communication are most heavily impacted by the remote work circumstances. And I see people using email chains for conversations, which really only serves to bury helpful information into a bunch of noise and clutter, and it's almost impossible to find what you need after the fact. Anyone still using email to chat with people need to look aggressively into some of the alternative means of communicating and creating internal practices to redirect casual communication to more productive avenues. And that's a struggle, creating those internal protocols to help redirect people, but it's a process of reinforcement and acknowledgement of what the challenges and the benefits of different methods are. And one of those productive methods can be instant messaging. If it's done with intention. It can also be a large distraction if implemented incorrectly or without intention. My company uses a messaging platform that has team and topic-based channels. We have conversation threading, 5+ years of record retention. We have searchability. We've got on-the-spot video conferencing is built into it, and document sharing. It's basically the digital equivalent of conversing with your coworkers with a document in one hand and a notepad in the other. And that's kind of how I approach the instant messaging tech that we use. It allows us to kind of create a pseudo environment where we're actually having a conversation. It's not quite the same as if you were talking over a wall or leaning over to your coworker's desk, but that's not quite how things work today. So these sorts of tools can, if done correctly, entirely replace the limited functionality of email. It helps to fill a niche need that email just doesn't do naturally. You no longer have to worry about who's CC'd on the email. Adding people to ongoing conversations is much more streamlined in an instant messaging environment if you get that capability to do that. And there's also a streamlined kind of referential integrity to that whole process in that instant messaging environment. But it's important to remember that not all instant messaging platforms work the same way. Many applications can lose the conversation when you close out, have limited or no searchability built in, especially after the fact, and have impaired document sharing capabilities. For my company, our instant messaging tool is a functional replacement for that in-person work communication. And if you don't have something like that already constructed in or available in your work environment, I would strongly consider either pursuing an option like that and evaluating whether or not it will work for you, or finding a substantial replacement that is not email that allows you to maintain some of that conversation. But even then, with instant messaging, there are plenty of times when typing a message is just never going to carry the right things, the right sentiments and the right mentalities. And it's really important to be able to see somebody and understand the body language. And to provide that discourse element, we certainly make heavy use of video conferencing tools. We're on Zoom right now for the webinar, and we use that internally for a lot of meetings. And it really helps to focus the way that we're talking and make sure that we're moving forward with the right intentions. Phone calls are also an acceptable substitute, I would say, for video conferencing. Again, cameras are a really important piece of the equation, but not everyone has access to that, and that does create some limits. But phone is still a strong way to maintain communication without having to wait for that message and response format that you get from email or from instant messaging, where the person may not be fully attentive or may not be attentive at that moment, and you have to wait for them to jump in. So don't let the accessibility of things like email or instant messaging trump the concept of being able to converse and discourse with somebody. It's important to use these technologies in a specific manner. And the way that I approach it, the theory kind of works like this. So for ideation, basically coming up with a plan, talking through some of the struggles, use your phone calls and your video conferences for that. That's the best mechanism for bouncing ideas off of one another, and use that to hammer out your plan of action. And then you can use instant messaging tools for working that plan of action as you progress through it. At the end of the day, you use the email for conveying whatever results came out of that action plan to clue in the key stakeholders that may not have been part of working that process. And then after the fact, you close out with another round of verbal conversation, and then you identify any key takeaways over IM. So just to bring that back into a nutshell here, use conferencing to set the plan, IM to work the plan, instant messaging to work the plan, email to deliver your results, conferencing to review your results, and then IM again to lock in and document those next steps. Before we move on to the next piece, I do want to spend a moment talking about VPNs. For you podcast listeners out there, this video is not sponsored by a VPN. I'm not going to stress one over another. I do want to talk about the importance of using a VPN when working remotely, particularly when dealing with sensitive business information or any controlled technologies. Export controls is what I'm talking about there. A lot of home Wi-Fi setups are virtually impossible to manage on a business scale, but using that VPN into your workplace for all work-related activities provides some degree of that cybersecurity to the traffic that's moving across your network. So you want to make sure your compliance practices are protected by a VPN whenever you're working remote, whether that's in your home on your own Wi-Fi or on your own internet, whether you're in a coffee shop or a hotel, or when you're traveling, if that ever happens again. But basically, any place that you're not in your home office, you definitely want to have a VPN protecting your traffic. Other cybersecurity measures should be in place, things like firewalls, ad blockers, antivirus, but I'm not going to really go into those as part of this conversation. But I do want to stress the importance of VPN for our trade compliance arena. So even with good technologies in place, communicating with the other departments and teams has honestly never been more strained. Working with your compliance colleagues is relatively straightforward, but when you've got to, because you're all kind of on the same message and the same mission. But when you've got to loop in the other parties in your organization that are maybe less compliance centric, is the way I'm going to phrase that. That was already a challenge even in the before times. That's only going to be exacerbated by the fact that you don't have that face-to-face, stop by their office, have a conversation environment that we're kind of used to, that allows us to bridge a lot of the uncertainty when it comes to these trade compliance circumstances and situations. So for those players in your organization where you want to ensure you've got a clear, concise, and consistent message coming across to them, you need to put in the extra effort to consider what it is you're trying to communicate and what your goals are. This is often overlooked when it comes to communication, but particularly when you're involving parties that don't have a compliance focus, it's important to be clear about what you need them to take away from the situation. And this is a challenge. It's the skill that needs practiced and developed, and rapport built up with the other departments and teams that you're working with. But that's an important element, is to be clear, concise, and consistent in your messaging. And that's whether we're talking about sales, purchasing, finance, legal, executive teams, whatever. They've never been more removed from trade compliant efforts than they have been in the last year. And you're going to need to make things as simple and direct for them to process as you can possibly manage. I've seen that play out several times over the last year. In some cases with disastrous consequences when the message was muddled, in some cases with great success when there was a lot of intention put behind that messaging. But that does mean spending more time behind the scenes to refine your objectives, consider your action items, clearly convey the need to know pieces, and then probably most importantly, following up to make sure the message gets across. A lot of times you're initiating conversations with these other teams and departments over email as a starting point, and in compliance, those emails can be dense or difficult to comprehend, or just certainly not relevant to that person's day-to-day. So you need to make sure that you're following up with them and you're doing the legwork to make sure that they're internalizing the message that you're trying to get across. If you're having a particular challenge that you want to unpack, please go ahead and use the question box, and I'll try to tackle them at the end of the webinar. Everybody's got a different scenario with their work environment, with their role in compliance or in logistics, and the struggles with communication are cover a wide range of possibilities, but they often dial into or boil down to one particular root cause that we can tackle one at a time. So if you have questions, I strongly encourage you posting those questions, and I'll get to them at the end. So then we come to our supply chain partners. They're going to be suffering from very, very fragmented communication channels, more fragmented than they ever were in the past. When working with your brokers and forwarders, which is what I mean by supply chain partners here, your best course of action is to create separate communication channels for your varying objectives. So if you're part of the troubleshooting team, make sure you've got a specific direction and email address dedicated to problem resolution. And that way your partners can email you for in the moment spot requests that need to be resolved immediately. And then if you're part of the oversight and accountability team, audit, whatnot, make sure you've got a separate channel for them to use for things like updating SOPs or maintaining metrics and KPIs, scheduling meetings, following up on any strategic action items that you have in process. You want to separate those communication channels so that you're not muddling the focus that you need to have when you're processing those emails. And most of us, honestly, are both troubleshooter and overseer. So we have to separate those roles within our own head, and how we approach that work when it comes into our inbox allows us to either be efficient or inefficient about the process, depending on what we've got set up to help steer that conversation. And maybe that means working with your IT teams to create separate email addresses, or maybe that means putting a keyword into your email subject lines. That's another possibility I've seen play out well, where they identify a particular role or function that they're trying to reach in the email subject line before they go on to the message of the email. And then lastly, working with the federal agencies, especially in the last year, we have to be particularly cognizant of their limitations. Getting through to Customs or Department of Commerce was challenging before, and that certainly has not improved in the current environment. So for most quick questions, honestly, your best bet is to work directly with a known human at the agency that you're trying to contact. So for example, if you're trying to get a hold of CBP and you're a CTPAT member, reach out to your supply chain security specialist. They're a great conduit, great first stop for getting attention to your customs related questions. They won't, in many cases, be able to answer your question, particularly if it's not CTPAT related, but they should help you identify an actual human that you can get a hold of to answer that question for you. And it's a little bit more directed than trying to go through a general inquiry phone number or mailbox. For people that aren't CTPAT members, if you're not already in the CTPAT program and you don't have a specialist assigned to you, one of the things that I strongly recommend is finding a contact that you can make at the agency that you're trying to get a hold of by asking relatively innocuous initial questions, very, very simple questions, maybe even questions that you know the answer to, and you just want them to weigh in to help you identify a human being on the other end, so that you're not dumping your important questions down the road into an anonymous email box and hoping that you get the response that you need to have. You can still do both methods, but working with a known quantity, particularly in the government space, gives you a little bit better advantage towards getting your questions acknowledged, recognized, answered, and getting that involvement that you need, particularly when you've got a federal level issue. If you are calling general helplines at CBP or Department of Commerce or any of the sub-agencies within there, you're often going to get a standard voicemail that says basically, nobody's on the phones right now, please leave a detailed message and someone will contact you within 24 hours. In my experience, they're pretty good about following up with that 24 hours, but you have to plan for that 24 hours to be part of the equation. You're not going to be able to get a quick response if you're just calling the general helpline. Also notably, most federal employees will not give you their direct phone numbers anymore, but they will respond to you with their personal email addresses. and I make a list of those email addresses, and I keep them on file for future reference. If I ever need a question in that same vein, I will include that person in my question. So that's a little bit of an advanced trick. Maybe if too many people do it, they'll start changing that practice. But for now, that's where I've gotten the most traction. And obviously, if you're working on a specific case with the government, definitely include all your file numbers, reference numbers in that correspondence. Leave nothing up to chance or to question. Assume that this is the first time they're ever hearing from you, even though you just emailed them yesterday on the same topic. And I think it's a good practice to have a specifically formatted email subject line and naming convention that you can use with that key reference number to help keep your communication straight, particularly if you have multiple concurrent issues open with federal agencies. So communication is a primary struggle point in the remote work environment, but so is record keeping. And in fact, it's grown more complicated in this distributed work environment. In our field, you have to remember that there's a permanent presumption of non-compliance. If you don't have a documentation trail with your records, you're not meeting that regulatory requirement. And if you're not meeting that regulatory requirement, you could be facing penalties, A, for not having the records in the first place, and then B, for having non-compliant entries or exports, potentially a double whammy. You can get hit with both penalties. So for your entry packets and your export documentation, you want comprehensive details. Your broker and your AES filer should have these records, and I strongly recommend a policy of obtaining these records for every single transaction and then tracking them by entry or ITN number, key dates like entry and export date, or any other key reference numbers that you use internally. Make sure you're retaining these records that the broker or the forwarder processed as an extension of those acts. You do have a regulatory obligation to retain these records for 5 years from the date of entry or 5 years from the date of export, but it could be some other amount of time depending on the nature of the transaction for any special circumstances like drawback filings or prior disclosures or other various circumstances where the retention period might be extended. It's never going to be less than 5 years. As you get those records back from your brokers and your forwarders, you need to reconcile those files against your ACE reports. And if you don't have an ACE account, that should be a top priority for you. Every importer exporter has the ability to see their internal transaction footprint through the eyes of CBP and Census by pulling the ACE reports. It actually shows you what CBP sees for your business under your EIN, what sort of activity they show. You can pull all your entry activity by any broker. You can pull all of the export filings, whether they're routed or non-routed transactions. You can identify those ITNs, and you can tie those back to the records that you're getting back from your brokers and forwarders, so you can identify what gaps there are so that you can go back and get those, the ones that they missed. If you rely on your broker to provide your ACE reports, keep in mind that they can only pull the records that they filed. They can't pull all of your records as under your EIN. There could be other brokers that are entering goods under your EIN that you would not have knowledge of because you didn't go check your own personal ACE report. We're not going to unpack how you pull the ACE reports, not on this webinar anyways, but there are government training resources out there. There's a link at the end of the slides that you can refer to as a way to get started on that process, and you can also reach out to us with your questions. So the document packets are never really the whole story, and that should not be the end of your record keeping efforts. I kind of alluded to this already, but you're working in a distributed environment now, so you've got to have a consistent method for maintaining awareness across multiple individuals, multiple teams working on particular transactions. Too many times we get called in to classify items and we learn that there's already a classification in use, but we don't have any records that help us identify that determination was not recorded. And that usually results in having to reclassify the item from scratch, which those of us in the field really hate duplicating work. And this is one of the most common forms I see is the lack of that baseline for the decisions that were made not being available and having to recreate that work from scratch. Worse yet, people who know better often just accept what's on file and treat it as truth because they don't have a resource to investigate. They don't even know where to start, or starting is just too much of an uphill battle that they'll defer to just accepting what the documents say because it's a hell of a lot easier than trying to figure it out from scratch. And that goes for things like HTS and Schedule B classification, also applies to USMCA qualifications or any other free trade agreements, ECCNs and license determinations, restricted party screening, basically any other trade compliance related decision. It's not uncommon for us to prefer to accept what's shown to us because we don't have any other place to start. And I recommend, from a record keeping perspective, creating a new environment where you know how you arrived at that determination, and knowing that that determination may be as essential to knowing what the classification is in the first place. Part of FDA qualification requires a defensible methodology. And honestly, as an organization, we often see that tribal knowledge is the most common means for storing that determination. It's in somebody's head. So one very basic way to start keeping track of your determinations is to create a folder on your network with an HTS heading. Drop in a file that explains which product lines fall under that heading or subheading, document some of the reasons and exceptions for the use of that classification, and then continuously over time expand and extrapolate from there. Create that breadcrumb trail that you can follow a year or 2 years or 3 years from now. And that's really the mentality we have to have when approaching record keeping. We have to assume from a trade compliance perspective, risk management perspective, the question will come up eventually. That's the default assumption that we typically work under. And if it comes up in 3 years, it's almost impossible to know what you were thinking at the time. Everyone on this call probably thinks that they're not going to forget what they decided. They're going to remember, but the reality is you won't. We have too much going on any given day to keep track of all those moving pieces. So you want to create a breadcrumb trail that you can follow after the fact. And if you've got access to things like trade management software, some of them allow you to tie in things like cross rulings, other notes based on product lines or individual SKUs that link directly in with your ERP systems. You might need to get creative here, but as a trade compliance professional, you should live by the adage that a stitch in time saves 9, or the way I look at it, an hour now saves 9 hours later. It's important that time, especially when you're dealing with a customs inquiry or some sort of a compliance issue, saving that time in a time of need is extremely important. Honestly, over 17 years, I have never once regretted having a starting point when approaching a past decision that was made. Any starting point is better than scratch. And then lastly, the correspondence is critical compliance info, and most people overlook it. Don't be afraid to print out your emails to PDF. Don't print them on paper anymore. That's not the world we live on. But print them to PDF. Save those alongside your entry packets in your export documents. Save them in that same folder so that you can tie in all the relevant information when you go to review that transaction. And transactions never occur in a vacuum. Your bookings happen separately from your shipping documents. Those happen separately from your export filings. Those happen separately from the entry filings. Those happen separately from any post summary or corrections that need to be filed on the export or the import. So it's important to recognize that snapshot in time that you get from your broker, your forwarder on the entry packet or the export documents is a very important piece, but one piece of the puzzle. A lot of times there's key info for restricted party screening that is going to be contained in the emails, particularly the names of parties. Those parties often don't get added to your ERP system or your software, so you never actually screen those individuals that were included on the emails. You're only going to be screening the key person that is on the account, the point of contact or the buyer, and not the actual other people that were copied in there that could be relevant to restricted party screening. You also want to be taking notes on your phone calls, particularly when you're discussing shipments, and then save them in an appropriate place. So if an issue comes up and it has to be resolved via video conference or phone calls, that's fine. That's usually one of the most effective ways to solve a problem is to get on the phone with somebody, but you need to make a record of whatever the key takeaways are from that call. Either somebody screwed up somewhere and you need to follow up with them so that they don't make that mistake again, or there was a misunderstanding, or you need to clarify a classification. Any of those factors should be documented as part of that transaction. So you can't, bottom line is you can't overlook the correspondence, the value of correspondence from a record keeping and accountability perspective. I do tend to field a lot of questions about record keeping requirements. So if you've got any questions in that vein, send them in right now. I'll try to answer it at the tail end of the webinar. Record keeping is a pretty dense topic. The specificity is difficult to get into on a kind of a general talk like this, but if you've got a specific question, I will be happy to hit it at the end of the webinar. So how you organize your records can be as important as actually keeping the records. Maybe it's not quite as important as keeping the records in the first place, but if you can't find the records when you need them, do you actually have them at all? I kind of already talked about some of the ways to organize your records by entry numbers or reference numbers or dates. And that's a great method for when you're using those centralized file servers. But for those of you that keep records inside your software and not on the file server, it's important to that you know what your IT policy is on record retention and storage. So many companies have a limited email retention policy. So anyone keeping records in email should pay particular attention to the limits on the email retention policies. I don't recommend keeping your records in email. It's a horrible place to keep them. Emails get corrupted all the time. They get deleted in mass data sweeps that the organizations do without warning. Issues happen. That's why I recommend printing out a PDF copy and saving that in a particular place. File storage tends to be far less of an issue when it comes to retention. Backups are done much more regularly and much easier than email backups are done. But if you do use email extensively for record keeping stuff, make sure that you've got special privileges from your IT department, or that you know that those records are going to be kept for at least the minimum 5 years for imports and exports. There are also a lot of ways to mismanage your record keeping. So one of the things I recommend doing is having an explicit plan and start with your basics. So where are you going to keep your records, which files you're going to keep, and where do those files come from? Who's going to be responsible for them? You want to work from that top down with those very, very basic elements so that you can create that hierarchy that you need to follow and understand, when you spend a few minutes thinking about your company, understand the types of transactions that you're going to be facing and what sort of architecture you need in your file storage and file retention tools. Do you have imports? Do you have exports? Do you have FTA documents? Do you have restricted party screening records to retain? Do you have ECCN research and determinations? Do you have ITAR? Make sure that you've got all of those factors considered and then identify which files need to be in there, where do they come from, who's responsible, that sort of mentality. You want to find that logical hierarchy based on how those records are generated to. You want to recognize if you're the one generating, or you or your company, if it's being generated by your broker, knowing how to get them into the process, or the freight forwarder, making sure you're getting their documents copied in. If they're coming from your vendors overseas, if they're coming from your customers, making sure that all of those angles are considered and represented in whatever file retention you have. Again, when you're looking at the whole scope of what records you need to keep, you need to consider who's going to be providing those documents and those records and at what point in the transaction, so you know how to circle back and know when it's done. You never want to try to transition to an entirely new record keeping method without testing it out first. A lot of the record keeping practices are individualized, and I do recommend using either we're going to trial this method for the next several shipments and then stop, review, figure out what worked and what didn't. It's also perfectly fine to do a from now on approach as your starting point. It allows you to evaluate whether your record retention is actually useful for your particular needs. And I wish I could say that the right way to do it is this, and do this, this, and this, and you're going to be fine. But as with so many things in trade compliance, you need to stop and think about what it is and how you're going to approach it and what's going to work best for your environment, particularly in remote work. And again, if you've got an environment that you want to unpack from a record keeping angle, Q&A is a fun place to unpack that, and I'm happy to do that at the end of this, assuming we have time. So when it comes to reviewing your records, you need to adopt a consistent methodology. In the previous step, hopefully you answered the question of which records you're keeping, and you should start with that as the baseline for your review process. Do I have all the records I'm supposed to have? Ask that question first. And if not, that's your first step. You need to go and get those records so that you know that your review is going to be comprehensive. You're not going to have any major gaps. And if you do have all the records that you're supposed to have, your next step is to figure out if the key information is correct. And you want to prioritize that key information based on your risk. So have you recently changed sourcing on some of your items? Then you need to verify country of origin is correct on the entries. It's not uncommon for brokers to by rote, you just enter what the last country of origin was for a particular item, particularly if they're using, or HTS number, particularly if they're using a database. And if you haven't effectively communicated the changes to them, it's entirely possible that they'll put in legacy information when they shouldn't be. And that it's up to you as the importer to recognize that. Do you have valuation issues because of related parties? You need to verify that your entries and invoices show the correct values so that the correct items get reported up to customs. Do you have customs rulings that just came into place that took effect? Make sure those rulings are cited on the 7501. Make sure you're showing the correct HTS on all your documents so that you can reflect that change going forward. I know a lot of this is resource intensive, or it sounds resource intensive, and I can seriously relate to that issue. But realistically, downtime will exist at some point, and record keeping is a phenomenal project for new people in particular to build up that familiarity with your internal practices. If you sit down and architect out what your record keeping practices need to look like, maybe you don't get to it tomorrow, but you know what the plan is supposed to be. And as soon as the opportunity presents, whether you've got some downtime because, oh my God, FTA season's over, entries are a little bit slowed down right now, and you've got some breathing room, or maybe you just want to give your brain a break from the hard stuff, and you can start working on putting your record keeping practice in place. Or, as I tend to find to be more successful, new hires and interns are great resources for tasking with these kinds of projects to help you build up your infrastructure and your overall compliance operation while learning what it is you're trying to accomplish as an organization is a good training ground for them. For those of you that don't have access to interns, but if you happen to be in Ohio, there is a fantastic program called the Ohio Export Internship Program. It's sponsored by and run through several colleges in the state. OSU's in there, Cleveland State's in there, Dayton University's in there, Youngstown State is in there, and I think several other colleges in the state are part of this organization, which is run through the Ohio Development Services Agency. And they have a batch of new students every year that are going through this internship program and learning about international trade, compliance, and export, and really focusing on some of these elements. These are fantastic resources to work on pet projects like record keeping that help you maintain your compliance as an organization without having to slot them into the really technical issues, because they are in most cases just an intern that is going to leave usually at the end of the summer. But it's a fantastic program. I swear by it. For anyone interested, I do definitely vouch for this program and the people that come out of it because they are phenomenal. There's a link at the end if you're interested in pursuing those Ohio export interns. And then lastly, risk management. So risk management in distributed environments is all about finding your primary vectors of noncompliance and then ensuring those gaps are shored up by awareness and solid process. You need to be able to gauge your exposure based on your business dynamics. And again, no silver bullets here. All of this is work. All of trade compliance is work all the time. But one of the most significant exposure vectors is your limited resources. Simply not being able to pay attention to every single angle. There are many ways to approach resource limitation, but the solution is never hope it never comes up. I recommend starting simply. Start by cataloging your risk factors. Just make a list. Is it classification? Is it origin? Is it valuations? Is it supply chain security? Is it process integrity? Go through everything that you can think of as possible risks for you. And if you don't know where to start, take a deep breath, reach out to somebody and say, hey, I am trying to figure out where my risk is. Where can I start? What can I look at? And then some of the resources that are out there, somebody will reach out to me and ask me that question. CBP's got priority trade issues that they pursue every year. That's a good place to start with identifying what the government considers to be risk. And then the BIS puts out an export compliance management program and manual, or at least a template for a manual or a roadmap for a manual that helps guide you on thinking about those processes. And there are actually a whole bunch of other resources. Those are the two that I have linked at the end of the slides here. So you'll get those after the webinar. But you can look back at the problems that you see occurring the most and start with that initial list and add on as you go, and then create a priority tree for how you're going to approach those. So once you've got that start and you start defining your risk universe, you can run a fairly simple assessment of how panicked you are about any given area, and then you start doing some initial digging. So if I've got a list of 18 things on my list, and I look at it, whichever one is causing me the most amount of panic is where I have to start. That's going to be my biggest risk exposure. That's the method I use, anyways. For other people, there are quantitative ways that you can measure what your actual risk exposure is. You can measure it in dollars, in volume, in damage to the brand if something were to happen. Various other considerations go into that universe. But as a trade compliance professional, I like to think that I have a good sense of what my panic moments are, and I go with the one that is giving me the most heart palpitations. And the first question I ask when I'm looking at these things is, do I have the records that I need to find out if I've got a problem here? If I don't have the records, then that's my first fix. Going back to what I was saying before, basically go through that methodology and those steps to see if I've got enough to cause my panic levels to drop, because I've got enough documentation and support to justify what's going on. For me, I know that if I can find errors, then I can correct them. I have the ability to do it myself because I've been around, or I know where to start the process. And oftentimes that's usually what the case is. I don't know the exact solution. I found a problem. I know who to ask. I know where to go to say, what's going on with this? And from there, I can build up a process around, all right, this is how I tackle this, and start finding and correcting the errors that I need to have. I frequently reach out to my own colleagues that are smarter than me. I ping the trade community via industry networks. Those of you that are in the industry recognize ICPA and NCBFAA, or I'll reach out to the federal government and ask for additional insights. I have no problem giving them a call and saying, hey, can you tell me about this? And they'll help out. Usually they don't give you solid answers, but they'll give me a place to start. And in this industry, it's really important that we rely and recognize that we need to rely on one another to solve some of these challenging problems. It is also important to remember that every trade compliance issue has a solution. May not be the one I like, but there is a definitive answer. And that's one of the nice things about trade compliance, is that you can always get to this is the answer if you work that problem. As long as I'm starting with that in mind, it's usually a lot easier for me to start down that path because I know that there's going to be an end. I know that I can get a conclusive decision on this matter, one way or another. One of the most challenging parts of risk management is needing to notify others. This is an area where I see a lot of people stall out, whether that's your coworker or your boss, another department, senior management, customer, supplier, supply chain partners, federal agencies in particular. Someone's going to need to be informed when you find a mistake. In remote work environments, this is where reliable record keeping and communication play the most important roles. That's why I zeroed in on those first. If you've set yourself up to succeed on both communication and on record keeping, you should have all the necessary information at your fingertips through the record keeping process. And you should also have a process for delivering a clear, concise, and consistent message. And again, I can't overstate how important that is to have that clear, concise, and consistent message. And from there, you should be able to plan out your next steps. If you've got the documents and you've got your message clearly laid out, you should know by default what your next steps are going to be. And the last phase that you have to have is that following through with your action plan, actually taking those next steps. I'm not going to unpack all the variables that go into this, but if you've gone through the precursor steps up to this point, the path forward should be pretty clear. If you're struggling with finding that path forward, then you need to be posing your hypotheticals to me at the end of this session, to your coworkers and your colleagues, and maybe they can help you steer in the right direction. So our primary focus areas for maintaining compliance in the current universe are communication, record keeping, and risk management. Those are our biggest challenges. But maintaining compliance is never quite enough. Customs agencies have repeatedly told me over the years that, and I'm using air quotes here, yesterday's best practices are today's minimum requirements. And they weren't kidding. Extra mile 10 years ago is old hat 5 years ago. Extra mile last year is standard operating procedure today. Those of you that have been in the industry for several years have recognized how rapidly things have changed. Trade compliance has been extremely fast-paced over the last few years, and it's not showing signs of slowing down anytime soon. We've had new trade wars, new AD/CVD investigations. We have a new NAFTA. We've got new CTPAT minimum security requirements. We've got new drawback. We've got new export controls. We've got new country designations with Hong Kong and ECCN export controls on China, Russia, and Venezuela. We've got new country designations, new GSP environment, new Incoterms, new classifications to navigate, and we've got a new remote workforce. All of that and more just in the last couple of years. It's mind-boggling how rapidly our field has been moving. These are, as we've all heard over the last year, unprecedented times. And fortunately or unfortunately, it's up to us to solve for progress. And that's where momentum comes in. Momentum is a state of mind, and I would challenge every trade compliance professional on the call today to really think about what generates momentum in your environment. Because of the rapid pace of change in our industry, the global economy has a spotlight on trade compliance like never before. It's a unique environment. Maybe the closest approximation I would have to it is back in the mid-90s when the Customs Mod Act was passed. But never since then have we seen this much focus on trade compliance. And back then it was important, and it's important today to leverage that attention to gain support for trade compliance initiatives. We're resource starved. Well, let's take stock of what has been going on in the trade compliance universe and use that as leverage to say, I need more resources. It's going to be this, or this. You pick, but I need more resources. And that's how you build your momentum. You take advantage of the environment. Yes, it's an environment of struggle, of challenge, of change, but you have to take advantage of that and use that to improve the outlook for yourself. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in really just tragic scenarios. I want you to use those tips on the communication slides that we talked about earlier on the record keeping. Make sure those are supporting your efforts. Make sure that you're managing your risk awareness. You should have the ability to pinpoint the pathways to create that sustainable momentum now more than ever. And if you walk away with anything from this webinar, it's that momentum is ours to make, and it's up to us to make it happen. And the other factor that I want to spend a few minutes kind of addressing here is personal accountability. Momentum comes from a well-balanced approach to personal accountability. Those of us that are reeling from the drastic changes of the last few years are the only ones positioned to recognize the impact and forge that path forward. That means balancing the responsibility for adapting to tomorrow's changes with adopting new tools and practices that position ourselves and our companies to succeed in spite of those challenges or in the face of those challenges. For some of us, that means taking a long, hard look at how we structure our remote work environment. It can be as basic as a clean, clear workspace, or as impactful as starting every day with a purpose and a direction. The importance of taking stock of today in order to set yourself up for tomorrow cannot be overstated. There's a world out there where you will succeed, and it's up to you to help make that world happen. It's important for me to those of you listening that you recognize that you have that power to make that happen. For those of us that have been around a while, we used to have the opportunity to just work a problem until it went away. But that's not really the world we live in anymore. Today, we're expected to identify solutions to problems and the means of approaching them from a different angle. Nobody said it was going to be easy. And then again, nobody works in trade compliance because it's easy, but it's on our shoulders to look for those solutions that create a sustainable environment that we can build on and build forward from and never have to go backward. It's important to recognize that you're not alone in this effort. You have a network of people around you. Now that so many of us work remotely, honestly, I found that the barriers to getting support from outside your own team have mostly gone away. People are much more willing to share their experiences and converse in this remote work environment and spend a few minutes just chatting. There's a lot of ways for us working our way through this new universe, but the fact is that we're in it together. And I think the trade compliance industry is starting to recognize that more so than ever in the past. And using communication with one another outside of our organizations to help bring solutions in that will help us stand on our own 2 feet. The more we reach out, the more we rely on one another, the stronger we're going to be. Over the last year, we've all made sacrifices. We've all dealt with personal and professional struggles. This past year, there's no way to look at the year without realizing that. But also, we have to recognize that support exists out there. Even if maybe they're not within our grasp at the moment, it takes that personal fortitude to approach these challenges and recognize them as opportunities to create a universe that lines us up for success. So for all of you that are struggling out there, I want you to know that you're appreciated and that there is always a way forward. Whether you need just bounce some ideas off of somebody, you can reach out to me or the train@startyourcity.org email address, ping your peers, but definitely try and build up your network and get that support that you need to help you keep your head above water, because it is up to us to make those solutions succeed. We're no longer in a troubleshooting environment. We have to solve the problems. So that concludes the session today. I am, again, open to your questions. We can take a minute to think about that. And actually, I will put myself on camera. So I think you can all see me. But yeah, I'm happy to field any questions you have. I do have one that was submitted beforehand that I want to tackle. And while I'm doing this, feel free to post any of your challenges. So the question I got was, my biggest challenge in work from home is my teammate starts an hour after me, and it's tough to get meetings and coordination going. And that's a pretty standard issue that I think we've all had to face at one point or another. I think the first thing I would do in that scenario is step back and recognize the trade-offs. Are you able to approach the work in a way that gives you both room to prepare and deal with your day? So one of the things that I recommend people do, if they've got an hour or two offset between when they start and when their coworker starts, if you're the one starting early, use that time in the morning to plan meeting topics and identify any priority items that come through overnight, and then distribute the work during your meeting so that you're both on the same page. So when that person starts, they're starting their day fresh. And then at the tail end, the person that's working later than you, ask them to do the same thing. Have them at the close of the day prioritize any open action items and close out the day with a notification to you so you know where to pick up tomorrow. A lot of these issues that we face with different schedules and different challenges like that boil down to that communication concern, and being able to communicate openly with your coworkers is extremely important. I think it's something that we've all kind of recognized the value of and learned pretty aggressively over the last year, that people are willing to work with us on these issues. Our coworkers are actually in it with us, and they're willing to throw in. If you haven't had that experience, that sucks, and I'm sorry, but the universe is out there for us to kind of figure out what is going to work best with whatever dynamic we have. We've all got our own personal scenarios. And before we wrap up, some resources out here. The Harvard Business Review article on our work from home or our work from anywhere future is a good read for people wondering about the ins and outs, the ups and downs of work from home or work from anywhere. The BIS Export Compliance Program and the Export Compliance Guidelines, those are two separate links. CBP's priority trade issues, ACE training and reference guides. There's a lot of information in there. We also do a webinar on ACE. I'm not sure exactly when that is, but it should be sometime this year, probably. If you have questions, you can always ask us. Record keeping requirements are cited there. And then external support, the Ohio Export Internship Program. Again, strongly recommend that group. Focus to Evolve's personal productivity training is a fantastic resource. And then Start USA is out here for you trade compliance nerds if you're struggling through a particular problem. Best practices in remote work, bottom line, stretch, reach out. Every problem can be solved. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in, so I am going to stop the recording. Thank you all.